Hi, and welcome back to my show. My name is Joe Alvarez, and you're watching Cinematicians. Today's episode features an interview between myself and my good friend Joe Susanka, who is also a cinephile, although a little more knowledgeable than myself. In this interview, we discuss his favorite subject, which is dark films, and looking at it through a Christian lens or Christian light. We also discuss one of my favorite topics, which is movies and morality. But then we also discuss things that we both thoroughly enjoy, which are Christopher Nolan's approach to human connection, but also C.S. Lewis's experiment in criticism, which I've already done a video about before. So I had fun putting it together. Please enjoy. Thank you for coming on.
Sure.
This is my first ever interview, so this is pretty exciting. So for those of you on the show, of course, this is a recording, but who don't know, my friend Joe Susanka here is obviously a good friend of mine and mentor, cinematically speaking. And he has, let me see, he's written many critical articles about film and storytelling, and he's given special attention to darker, more nuanced kind of noir films, especially in his orations on the subject. So, Joe, thanks for coming on. Yeah.
Sure, you bet.
Yeah. So I was listening to the speech you sent me earlier, and again, that was a really cool speech. I loved it, and definitely love hearing about how one can put a Christian twist on the darkness of the world that we see in art and movies and media and stuff like that.
Sure.
So you kind of go into this in your speech, but if you wouldn't mind, would you tell us the story of how you kind of got into film and how you kind of focused in more of the darker films direction?
Sure. Yeah. So it was interesting. I had not listened to that talk for a little while myself. So I actually listened to it today for the first time in, I don't know, about five or 6 years now. It's one of those things where I experience the same thing when I read stuff that I've written also. I like, wow, I don't remember thinking that. I like that, but I don't remember thinking it.
Right.
I think in a lot of ways though, what I have kind of come to uh I guess there was kind of an instinct that I had for these things. And then what I tried to do was to figure out where that instinct came from. And a lot of that for me was influenced very much by Flannery O'Connor. Not so much, I think certainly in her fiction she does this, but more in some of her essays she wrote, right, where she talks about, she uses the idea, she says, that kind of modern man is not very attuned to the what she calls the intrusions of grace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the violent, she says, the violences that precede or follow upon the grace, right? And I think when I watch movies, that's often the context in which I'm watching them, right? So I think dark movies, certainly there are just some movies that are dark. Sometimes I watch a movie and think, oh, that was terrible.
Kind of
Not that
unnecessarily dark.
not that the craft was terrible, but the kind of the message is terrible, right?
Right.
And now I feel like that there is in fact no light in it, right? But often I think I watch a movie and think there's a lot of darkness in this movie, but that doesn't prevent the light from coming through at all. In fact, it kind of emphasizes it in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that tends to be the lens through which I'm watching things. The idea that there are these moments of grace in a lot of these stories. And what I'm looking for is those moments of grace. And often, in O'Connor terms, they're preceded by or followed by violence, right? So kind of the darkness and the suffering around them, I find makes that the grace more noticeable to me.
Okay.
So that's, I think, kind of the philosophical underpinnings of it. Right? I've also I came across this idea. I think it was in a podcast by a fellow who writes about music, or talks about music that I really like. And he talks about the idea of, I think, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced. I think it's Ma. It's spelled M-A, but it's a Japanese idea, mostly connected to architecture, about negative space, right? So the idea that the shape of the building, or of many things, it doesn't just have to be a building, is made manifest because of the things that are missing, or kind of the absence or the negative of the space. And I
Okay.
think that's the same kind of idea for film, right? So I can see the grace often through its absence, or through the kind of the negative of it, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've heard of that term even, well, in the context of cinematography, like the visual aspect of
mhm,
movie making, right? And
sure,
camera work. Like you also see those empty spaces that are such a big part of the shaping of the picture, not just what's in it, but what
right,
isn't. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Well, that's pretty cool. So that's kind of
So I guess that's my philosophy as much as anything else, right? And I think it applies to a lot of different things. It's not just a movie thing, but cinema certainly has come to be my beloved art form, and so I see it there. I think it manifests itself in many places, but cinema is where I've gravitated.
yeah. Okay. So that also reminds me of is actually a poem that I learned at WCC was Batter My Heart. Um
Hmm.
I believe that's John Donne, and that's kind of the same mode that you're talking about, violence and darkness, and that Flannery is
Right.
talking about in Violence and Darkness. So
Hmm.
so it's batter my heart, three-person God for you as yet, but knock, shine, seek to. Oh man, Dr. Schubert, Jesus. But I stumbled over that. But it's like you're asking God to really burst into your heart in a violent manner, because he's only what the poet is experiencing is kind of a soft knocking
Hmm.
rather than a forceful pounding into his soul. So
Right.
that's kind of how I'm understanding what you're talking about with darkness and violence.
Right. Right. And that poem is great. It reminds me of a quote from Fulton Sheen, right, where he said, "Sometimes the only," I paraphrase a little bit here probably, but sometimes the only way into a person's heart is for God to break it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there is kind of a resistance to that, and I think that is very connected to what Flannery O'Connor talks about, which she's talking about even the idea of the intrusion of grace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess we briefly touched on this, but I'm wondering how often you run into the situation where there's maybe too much of that and or not enough light. One example that I personally have experienced is when I tried to watch the show House of Cards. I don't know if you're
Uh-huh.
familiar.
Hmm.
It's very politically a lot of political intrigue, and it's very dark. Also,
Right.
kind of a Shakespearean tragedy, but
Hmm.
without
It's Macbeth
the
in a way,
light.
right? Yeah, but
Yeah, kind of Macbeth,
hmm.
but just for episodes on end. And
Hmm.
and personally, I couldn't find much light in there. Like all the good guys were kind of going, getting taken out. The bad guy wasn't really learning anything, or at least the main character, right? So, that's my personal experience. Is that like a
Sure.
common thing that you would find, or I don't know?
So I guess right. So I think with any kind of theory or universal,
Mm-hmm.
it lends itself to some particulars, but you always have to look at the particulars, right? And I
Right.
think certainly that sometimes I will watch something, and for me, when I was thinking about this today, um, an example that came to mind for me was um, The Departed, right? The Scorsese film, right? Where I don't know if you've seen that, or if you remember it. The very last shot of that movie is um, the an image through a window of I think it's the Capitol building in Boston,
Okay. Yeah.
or the city hall maybe, or and then there's a actual rat that's running across the windowsill. And if I remember correctly, that's kind of the last frame of the movie. And I felt like, okay, so first of all, that's a little on the nose, kind of in terms of visual metaphors, but it feels like the point of that movie is to say there are rats everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I get that with that, and I think there are certainly a lot of rats, but that feels kind of cynical, right? This is kind of a cynical way of looking at the world. If a movie, there are certainly reasons to be cynical about various things. I think House of Cards is about politics. If one were to be cynical, that would probably be a realm in which it is more appropriate than anywhere else. Um, but the cynicism becomes, in some ways, feels to me like it almost becomes the point, right? And that is harder for me to apply kind of this philosophy to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll watch that and think, oh, I think that movie or that TV show thinks differently about the world than I do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's right about the world, but its perspective is other than mine, right? And sometimes I think the darkness is the only thing that comes through there. Um, I don't care for those as much. Usually I get done with those and I think, may have been very well made, but I feel like it's suggesting something about the world that I don't think.
Yeah.
And so it's somewhere down there, it ends up feeling to me, not intentionally maybe, but somewhere down there, it feels false to me. Like, I don't think this is the way the world is. And so I think it has maybe beautifully, in terms of craft, portrayed something that I think is actually inaccurate. I'm much more inclined to appreciate something that portrays the world in its darkness and its suffering with the light that I see shot through, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Oh man, I had a thought. Anyway, um, yeah. So, oh dang it, that's awkward. But um, I guess tragedy also comes to mind specifically,
sure,
and sometimes it feels like a kind of redemption is lost, maybe. And Shakespeare has written a ton of different tragedies with more or less lights of redemption in that. Can you speak
sure.
to tragedies
Mhm.
as opposed to dark films with a sense of redemption in them?
Sure. So so let me kind of clarify or refine part of this idea a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Again, to go back to Flannery O'Connor, right? So uh, I think the fact that there are moments of grace is important. That doesn't mean that they're accepted
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, right?
Yeah.
So that also seems to me faithful to the world. I see people and I think, that does seem accurate, but they reject the thing that they needed to accept, right? The thing that feels to me most faithful to the way I view the world in those cases is the fact that there is that grace or there is that light. That doesn't mean that we always accept it or that we recognize it, right? Sometimes you might watch a movie and it does, I think, kind of in the tragic sense, you see the grace there and the character does not, right? And so you
Mm-hmm.
end up that's in some ways it seems to me that the tragedies that feel the worst, right? Kind of in the Aristotelian sense. Here's a person who's better than I am and falls, right? And so there's a thing there's the idea both that they were capable of being so much better than I am, but didn't see this thing that I see in watching their story, and that kind of led to their downfall, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what I would say is the idea of seeing the intrusions of grace or the moments of grace or grace kind of shot through the whole world doesn't necessitate happy endings,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's also faithful to the way the world is, including in our own lives. I mean, hopefully, I'm doing it in smaller ways than what you might have in a movie. But I'm always thinking back on things and thinking if I had done, there was a moment here when I could have done this thing and I didn't do it. And that's the thing that I should have done, right? So I don't think the idea of seeing the opportunity for grace in things means that you get happy endings all the time. Quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay, yeah, that's neat. That's neat because it's an opportunity seen but lost is what you're saying. Yeah.
right,
Mhm.
and often it seems to me the kind of the catharsis of it for the audience is that in many cases, especially in a tragedy, is that we see it
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
while we're watching. They don't.
Yeah.
That's kind of the reason both it's sad to watch, but also that's where the catharsis comes from, right? From the fact that we recognize the thing that they didn't see.
Well, in the art of the
Um,
film too, the audience is kind of omniperceptive because they have all the different angles. They see everything that's going on for the most part. Some
right.
some movies may be such that it only has the one angle of the story.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
but I guess two things that come to my mind is yet another poem, but this one by William Shakespeare is they that have power to hurt and will do none. It talks about how those with power who are good but fall are worse than those who are already terrible. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds.
Right.
Is the final line. So that's kind of the sense of tragedy that I'm understanding.
Mhm.
And to speak to that, I think one tragedy that we both thoroughly enjoy is The Godfather, right? And that's talking about Michael Corleone and his he was a war hero, and then he had a decision which was to avenge his father, right? And that was like the moment. And of course, there were steps building up to that, but that was the
Sure.
moment of tragic fall for him, where he no longer is going to be a legitimate member or a Corleone family, but
Mhm.
is becoming uh, the recipient, the heir to his father's crime family. So that's
Right.
kind of what I
And in
would
fact,
that. Mhm.
right. In fact, one of the things it seems to me that one of the things that's so tragic about that particular story is that there's an inevitableness to it that you see right from the very beginning. Vito does not want him to do that thing, right?
Mhm.
So there is a way in which he's trying to keep Michael out of the very thing that happens, right? And and in fact, what you end up with Michael is I don't. I'm trying to think back to it. This may not be as clear just in The Godfather as it is if you watch both the first two, right? But um, what Michael becomes shows you that he was right to try to avoid it, and that his father was right. He in many ways falls much further than Vito does, right?
Yeah.
He becomes a very different kind of person than his father was, uh, and it kind of gives it shows you that his father was right in the judgment he was making there and the efforts to keep him out of this, right? And that happens at the very beginning, right? At
Mhm.
the very beginning, you get the kind of the desire on Vito's part to keep him out of this, right? Um, and then of course one of the things that happens is not just that he's avenging his father, but that his older brother is eliminated kind
Right.
of in the family succession, right? And there are ways in which his older brother uh, was much more likely to kind of maintain some. I don't. Goodness is not the right word, right? But there's something about him which seems not as calculating and not as bitter as Michael is. Once Michael kind of goes down that path, right?
Right. Well,
Sonny is Sonny's.
yeah, he's a hothead. He just goes
Yep.
for it. Yeah. He's
Right.
very,
Which in a way is his downfall, but it's a
yeah.
downfall which leaves you somehow um, with someone who's better in his downfall than Michael ends up being, right? Um,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Well, I mean, you have that kind of Dantesque layering there, where the in hell you have the people who are sinners against the flesh, so to speak, but they're in the
Mhm.
higher rings. But then you have
Right.
those who are like sins against intellect, who are much lower. So yeah, you can tell, and I'm going to bring up another reason for this is how
Sure.
Coppola was very very focused on Italian literature. And I say this because it's also very Machiavellian principle that he's talking about
Mhm.
here,
Mhm.
where Machiavelli is talking about if you must be loved or feared and cannot have both, the prince must be feared. And you see that kind of tackled with Vito Corleone and Michael Corleone. Their differences. Vito, the first thing he does is he talks about he tells Bonacera that he wants to be friends, right, so to speak. That could be
Mhm.
manipulated
extent.
Hmm.
But the very first thing that we see Michael doing as Godfather is just using fear and killing off his enemies immediately, and
Hmm.
showing who's
Hmm.
boss by that. So there's all of that deep Italian layering that beyond just such a good story that it is.
Sure.
Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, so I mean that's just my being a big fan of The Godfather. As you can probably see, I have that poster right there.
Right.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so let's see. So back to your speech a few
Sure.
years ago. I listened to it for the first, admittedly for the first time when you sent it to me.
Uh-huh.
And I found it very interesting, your perspective on the Dark Knight trilogy, with
Hmm.
Nolan being focused on Bruce Wayne rather than Batman, and maybe that's more widely known than I imagined, but I had never thought of that. So I immediately watched it after listening to the speech, and found it found almost a new perspective in watching
Hmm.
that.
Oh,
Um,
good. Good.
and
Good.
there's a lot to unpack with those films because
Sure.
they're so popular. And actually, this was the first time I watched The Dark Knight Rises, which was really funny. Um,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So, yeah.
Because did you watch them all relatively close together? Because I
Yes.
think
Like
there's a wonderful.
immediately after I finished your speech, I started Batman Begins, and then it took like 2 days to finish all three of them.
Right. So
Yeah.
so it's striking to me how I think in a lot of ways the Dark Knight is the one that kind of got the most critical acclaim in a lot of ways, right? But the way in which Batman Begins and The Dark Knight Rises are mirrors of each other, I think is very interesting, including visually, right?
Yeah.
So the whole sequence with the with the prison and the cave, right? The way that those things mirror each other, and the way that he escapes from both of them, right? But kind of at different stages in his life. Um, I can remember. So when you watch them, as they came out, um, that was not so clear,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
So I love watching them close together because you see that the kind of the parallelism that he's setting up there. And then you talk about classic literature, right? It's kind of the famous story of Jonathan Nolan having read Tale of Two Cities and then telling Christopher Nolan he has to read Tale of Two Cities, and how much of that works into The Dark Knight Rises. Like not just the quote of it's far better thing I do now than I've ever done before. Not just the Sidney Carton thing, but kind of the way in which Gotham becomes almost like Paris in the Reign of Terror. And you even have that scene where uh, the Scarecrow is serving as the judge over people,
Yeah.
and Bane is off on the side actually knitting, right? So like Madame Lafarge, like there are all these things that he kind of works in there, right? But the idea of I think for me the thing that has always stood out the most in that trilogy is the idea of um, Wayne's movement uh, from thinking that you govern people by making them afraid, which would be very Machiavellian, to thinking that you would rule people by lying to them. Right? You can get people to do what you need to by telling what you think they need to hear. It doesn't really matter if it's true or not. Right? The idea of the noble lie. Uh, to all the way to all the way to come out the other side and say, actually, you realize the way you persuade people to be good is to be good yourself, right? Not you don't try to manipulate them that way, right? So that's the movement which I think is, well, there's a lot of things that are my favorite about the trilogy. I love the trilogy,
It's a lot of good
but
things. Yeah.
that movement from for Bruce Wayne to come from fear to deceit to just kind of goodness is the arc that I love the most, right? And
Mm.
that's why I tend to think of them as almost one. That's just basically one long movie. It's hard for me to
Best
kind of break
trilogies
it up
are,
into
right?
pieces.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Practically. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that was kind of tied to a little question I had on it, and it's a very
Sure.
somewhat stupid question, but I am curious. There's obviously
Hmm.
the themes of the villains practically, right? And you might have touched on this in your speech. Batman Begins, you have Scarecrow, and the theme for him. Well, then you also have kind of Ra's al Ghul, but that's a whole other deal.
Sure.
The theme there still is fear, is what I understand, and then the theme of the villain in Dark Knight is chaos, and the of course, because it was my first time, I hadn't really had been able to think about it much, but The Dark Knight Rises, I'm assuming, like, is that just pure evil with the villain there? What would you say about that thing?
So, so this is interesting. Yeah. So this is spoilers territory, right? But so I tend to think of the Joker as, in some ways, the purest of evil, because I tend to think of chaos as there's he feels to me like the most unpredictable and out of control, and the person who has, in fact, no rules, right? I think one of the things that strikes me as most interesting about The Dark Knight Rises is that there isn't a villain in the same way, right? So there's the I mean, Tom Hardy and as Bane is an incredible physical presence, right? He's this huge kind of blunt instrument,
Right.
And especially when if you watch it closely after The Dark Knight, especially in contrast with kind of how mercurial and wild the Joker is, right? In many ways, he seems kind of like physically the exact opposite.
Yeah.
But also, as you get towards the end of that movie, you realize he's not really a villain the way you thought he was, right? I mean, he is motivated. He's not even motivated, as Ra's al Ghul is, by thinking that the city needs to be cleansed. He says that, right? But the reason he says that is because of Talia, not because he thinks that, like, he's motivated by the fact that he loves her, right? So there's this weird kind of turning on itself towards the very end there, where you realize that he is doing something entirely because of one person. It's not some huge, we think Gotham needs to burn so that it can be cleansed, the way it was with Ra's al Ghul, or as it is with Talia. For him, he's doing it simply because he loves her, right? So there's an incredible particularity to what he's doing, and kind of specificity. And it's done by, it's misguided, but there's this notion almost of having this fellow you thought was this villain all along, who suddenly is doing something out of affection. Like, that's a very strange space, right? And I feel like in some ways what happens in that movie is, because of that turn, right, you don't feel like you really have a villain, because Talia does not get the opportunity to be a villain in a way long enough for you to really react to her that way, right? Which is partially, again, why I think the point of that movie is very much connected to Bruce Wayne and what's happening with him. And it's important in that context that he have a foil, but it's important for it not to be as kind of dominant or overwhelming a foil as the Joker is, for example. So what ends up happening at the very end of that movie is almost that Nolan pulls the kind of the villain rug out from under your feet, and you're left just thinking about Bruce Wayne, because the villain has kind of evaporated, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's kind of the way, because there's that moment where you realize not just that Bane is doing these things out of his love for Talia, but she reciprocates that, right? She has that same, and then you can get through the whole thing where you realize that Bane's not the one who's climbing out of the prison. He's the one that gets left down behind and ends up being attacked, and that's why he ends up having to wear the mask, because he's in pain all the time, right? But one who actually escapes from the prison is Talia, right? Talia, I hope I'm saying that right. But and then I think that's, for me, that just underscores the point that it's important for the story and for what happens to Bruce Wayne for these things, for there to be these villainous pieces, but they are not going to capture your attention the way he does, right?
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting that you say that, because as you were talking about how it's not the idea of destroying Gotham that is motivating Bane, it's his love for Talia. And somewhere, I can't remember where, I heard that Nolan was fascinated with the author Jorge Luis Borges. I don't know if that yeah. And there's this short story called Deutsch Requiem, and it's about a Nazi who's about to be executed for crimes against humanity. And he's writing. Okay, cool. We may have to start the Zoom session again just to keep it going.
Oh,
yeah. I just got a notification. But
I should have sent mine. I've got one that we don't have to time out, but
okay, yeah, maybe we'll figure that out some other day. Well, oh yeah, so he's writing about it was philosophy and the ideas that motivated him. And I guess Nolan almost is responding to that by saying, well, humans aren't necessarily like that altogether. They actually have something deeper than the philosophy, than the ideology, strictly speaking, that motivates them. It's something much
right.
deeper. Yeah.
Right. And so not to get too far down the Nolan track necessarily, but I think that's very much the point of Interstellar, right? So you've seen Interstellar, right? So so what you have with Interstellar is Nolan saying, look, people don't do these things kind of out of some kind of altruism. They don't. I mean, Hugh, subtly named Hugh Man, right? So that fellow who goes off thinking that he's doing these things for the good of humanity, that is not enough. That does not motivate him to do the things that he needs to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Matthew McConaughey's character is doing those things for his daughter, right? So that it's the love kind of an affection and motivation of particular people that makes you do those things, not kind of some large vision of what humanity should be like or should not be like, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why the Michael Caine's character in Interstellar has the rage against the dying of the light. That's kind of his the poem that kind of represents him, right, is an angry one, is one that's almost bitter in a way, right?
Yeah.
Unlike what McConaughey's doing is in some ways what he's doing is much more difficult than what Michael Caine is trying to do, but it's also motivated by his love of particular people, in this case for his daughter primarily, right?
Mm-hmm. Now that this idea has been brought up, I'm suddenly realizing like almost all of Nolan's films are like this. You even right, and he's doing it for his kids. He wants to see his kids again. And then you have, I guess, I haven't exactly seen all of it, but Memento is a similar deal where he has, I think it's his wife who has his motivation there. And then and this would probably kill me on the internet, but I haven't seen Oppenheimer quite yet. Have you seen that? Is it kind of a similar deal there going on?
I think he's often grappling with the same ideas. Kind of the balance he gives to them can vary, right? Another thing that he is always grappling with is the idea of truth, and I think Memento falls into that camp. Certainly, The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises grapples with that a lot, right? So those are things which are also very much on his mind. Oppenheimer, I'd love to talk to you about it after you watch it. I think it's very, very interesting. It's also in a lot of ways, circling back a little bit to tragedy again, I think it's a very sad movie. But because of the way he kind of juggles time, like he always does, the force of the sadness gets a little bit lost until you think about it. You realize what's actually happening there. And then it's a very melancholic movie, I think, in a lot of ways.
On the subject of Oppenheimer,
sure.
One thing that I think got a lot of our fellow Catholics kind of upset were certain, say, bedroom scenes, right? And just building off on that theme, I'm curious about your take on how perhaps your faith has helped you approach film with certain kinds of content, like bedroom scenes that are not totally family friendly. I guess there's prudence involved with kids, but to what extent have you, I don't know, thought about morality in that sense as an
Sure.
audience. What is your position on that?
Sure. I feel like maybe you're trying to get me in trouble here. No.
I already got myself in trouble by writing a thesis on this.
Right. So I guess yeah. So my thinking on it is, I think, informed by uh you mentioned an experiment in criticism, right? I think the first thing that I would say is I think it is difficult. It's difficult to know. Let me see how to be clearest about this. So I guess what I would say is, it's one of the things that I like about an experiment in criticism is that Lewis basically says it's important to be criticized by somebody who likes what you're doing, right? Or by those who love. It is there is a way in which you should, if you're a critic, you wouldn't necessitate that everybody watch everything to have an opinion about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it is tricky to have an opinion without having read something or without having watched something.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the assumption can be certain things are never okay. I think I agree with that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
But whether this particular movie is an instance of that or not is hard to know if you don't engage with it in some way, right? So I think that's what's interesting to me about Lewis's experiment in criticism, right? The idea that if you're going to be a critic about this thing, then you need to engage with it. You need to kind of, not, I won't say meet the author halfway or something, right? Because I don't think you do that. You actually meet the author all the way or not at all. I don't know what halfway means, right? But you either say, I think the author is trying to do something. I'm going to see what he's trying to do and then have an opinion about what I think he's trying to do. Or you can say, I think probably what the author is doing is bad and I'm not going to engage with it at all.
Yeah.
I respect both of those positions. I think it is tricky to say what this author is doing is bad, although I have not seen that it's bad, right? So I think it's easier for me as a critic is to give myself more weight than I actually have, right? But as a viewer, I tend to think of it in terms of what I think is okay, is okay or safe or prudent or wise for me to engage with or not. It's harder for me to know whether the author is trying to, or artist is trying to engage with something or not. If I think I should probably not do it, right? So it's not so much in my mind a question of whether some things are okay or not. It's more a question of what I will say is, I think I am not going to engage with this particular work of art. I don't think the particular kind of thing, and my own understanding of my own position is, this is probably going to go further than it's helpful for me to see, so I'm not going to see it, right? But that's in some ways a judgment on my side. I might even think to myself, maybe this artist should not have made this thing, but it's hard for me to know that that's the judgment to be made about it if I don't engage with it, right? So I think the way I kind of describe it is, I certainly, there are certain things that I've seen where I say, I am not recommending you watch this. I would be very interested in talking with people who have watched this thing about it, but I'm not comfortable saying everybody should watch this because it is close enough to the line of that I could easily imagine people being on the other side of it. So I'm not kind of comfortable recommending it, right? But that's different than saying it should not be made, right? Now, I do think I have watched things and then thought this should not have been made. Also, I shouldn't have watched it, but also shouldn't have been made. This is not this is not contributing to anything, right? But
Right.
I'm more reluctant to say this is a thing which I have heard described to me in some general terms, and I'm comfortable saying it should not be made. I'm like, well, that's a harder step for me to see, right? And that's what I think Lewis is talking about in an experimenting criticism, right? Where he says you should, if you're going to tell somebody they've done something bad, you should know that they did something bad, right? And you can't really do that if you don't kind of, I don't know if in good faith is quite the right way of describing it, but if you don't kind of make a good faith effort to see what they're trying to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is not terribly coherent, I realize, right? But it's partially because I don't find a position on it terribly easy to identify. Right? I will see some things and think, I remember people saying that this was terrible, and then I watched it and thought I came away thinking there was something really good about it. So now I'm confused as to. And then sometimes what will happen is I will end up having a conversation with that person, discover that they didn't watch it.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay, that's a different thing, right? So I can remember writing about The Dark Knight, and thinking it's really interesting for a lot of different reasons. Also, so The Dark Knight was kind of a tricky movie to write about because I got to the end and I thought, wait, this is about lying, and he shouldn't, and he did, and now I'm not sure what position the movie's taking. I need to see how the story ends, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was kind of striking almost immediately in The Dark Knight Rises. You have Blake's character saying, you should not have done this thing. This was the wrong thing to do, right? But I remember writing about The Dark Knight and thinking, gosh, I don't know precisely what I'm supposed to think about this movie because it looks like it's saying that Batman should do this thing. And I think that's probably the wrong thing to do, right? But I remember kind of the I might even have been the first comment that was on it or something. So somebody said, clearly this is about the devil, and so nobody should watch it. And I thought, maybe this is true for you. Maybe you should not watch this. But now there's really no way to talk about it. Like I think if you were to watch it, you would discover things about it that you thought were worthwhile. I certainly did.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's about the devil, but I don't think it's about the devil in a way which makes him appealing, right? So I'm not against making the devil unappealing, both powerful and unappealing. That's a helpful way of thinking about the devil. But it is something which just kind of stops the conversation immediately, right? And I think as my my judgment has been, look, as audience members, I think it's important to have some sense of yourself, and there are movies that I will start and not finish. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is not going to be something which is helpful to me or will produce something that I think was a net positive. So I'm out. Like this is not a helpful thing for me to engage with. Now, if somebody said, is this a bad movie? I'd say, I don't know. I didn't like the part that I got up to, but I don't really know where it ended up. So it's hard for me to judge it that way. But I think as audiences, we should do that. We should say, okay, this is not, I think this is going too far. This looks to me like it's going to go up to and then well past this line that I have in my life that I do not cross. So I'm not going to watch it, right? I think that's something we should always be doing. But I think that's something that should be connected to our understanding of ourselves, and not necessarily what we think might happen in something, right?
Right.
So I don't generally the idea of boycotting something, it usually strikes me as, well, I don't know, I don't think I want to watch this. So I guess if you want to say it's a boycott, that's fine. But I don't know if I would be comfortable saying no one should watch this
Mm-hmm.
until I've seen it. Maybe I would watch it and say nobody should watch this. Then that's fine, right? But to say that without experiencing it in at least some way, or
Mm-hmm.
making what I think Lewis is talking about is kind of a good faith effort. Like, okay, so I've heard that what you did was really weird, but I'm going to try and see if it is as weird as people are saying it is. And then you watch a little bit and say, yeah, okay, I guess people were right about that. I'm on this side of things now, but it's shaped a little bit by at least an attempt to meet the author where or artist where or filmmaker kind of with what they're trying to do, right? So I certainly I'll watch movies and get to the end and think, gosh, I'm glad I'm not that person's head. Like I don't that just feels like a terrible way to think about the world. Um, and I think it's wrong. And I will not be returning to this. And if other people ask if they should watch it, I'll say, no, I don't think so. I think it's not worth watching. But that those are judgments that I think should be made kind of with one's own knowledge of oneself, right? Okay, because one of the things that I'm so, for example, for me, um, with the little bit of film school that I did and a little bit of working on sets that I did, it is rare for me to see violence that looks real.
Mm.
I'm like, okay, so there's squibs there, and like, plus if it's Mel Gibson, it's super slow, and that's. I mean, it's rare for me to see something and think I feel like I watched somebody get killed. Like that's rarely my reaction to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't think it's so much a matter of being desensitized, because I think it's more a matter of being kind of aware of the gears and pulleys, and
Right.
this is in fact a craft of some sort, and I know how this was made.
Mm-hmm.
It does rarely strikes me as this is incredibly violent. There are some exceptions to that, right? But so usually I can watch a movie that has a fair bit of violence in it without feeling like my soul is being rubbed away or something, right? That's not true for everybody. There are people who tend to react more viscerally to those things. Then those people should, if they're kind of thoughtful about what they're doing, probably want to watch less of those things, right?
Mm. Yeah.
But I think often that's kind of a matter of not entirely individualized judgments. I don't just want to say, well, truth is different for every person or something. I don't want to turn it into that kind of thing, right? But there is a way in which I think as audiences, we should be self-aware.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are self-aware, then we'll say, okay, well, I'm starting to get down this path here, and I don't think that's really necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to either not watch anymore, or what I what I do with my own kids sometimes, which is, okay, so now is the time for you to be looking somewhere else.
Yep.
It doesn't mean there's nothing to be. It doesn't mean that we won't watch the movie that has anything at all. I mean, The Godfather is a good example, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's that one moment in The Godfather after he goes to Italy where he's married, where clearly there's married type activity,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not necessarily something that my 16-year-old boys need to see.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't, right? But there are a variety of ways of doing that, right? You can say, well, let's this is a point that I don't think is necessary for the kind of the overall point the movie is making, and let's move on from here. Or one could say, don't watch The Godfather. That feels like I'm less comfortable being in that space, right? Because it feels like there is, I don't know, there's a little more black and white there than I'm comfortable with.
Right.
I don't think it's a matter of just kind of justifying things to myself. I do think it's, I guess this is another thing that I wrote, article that I wrote, largely inspired by Lewis's experiment criticism, right? Which is, I think we should be a little, if we're a thoughtful, sincere audience members, I think we don't have to be quite as afraid about what we're doing or what we're watching as sometimes we can be, right? But I think an important part of that, in my mind, is kind of the movement I made at probably just around after I got out of college, right? But to start to think of movies or cinema as more of an art form and less of an entertainment. Like I think they cross over a lot, right? But to start to think of movies as somebody trying to present something,
Mm-hmm.
or with movies, one of the reasons I love it is because it's so collaborative, right? There's actually a lot of people that are working together to try to kind of give you a story for you to watch and experience and think through, right? And I think if you tend to think of movies as primarily entertainment, you don't tend to think about them after. So one of the rules I have when I'm showing movies to the college kids, right? I said that the there are three rules. You don't talk when the movie's playing, and that may be just because I'm an old man and I want the kids to get off my lawn. I can't. It drives me nuts. We will pause at any time. If people have actual questions, instead of just saying it, let's go ahead and pause and let's just kind of see what those questions are, right? We can deal with them whenever you want, right? Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is always the one that happens, right? We get about 20 minutes into that movie and nobody has any idea what's going on. And we can pause there and then figure stuff out. But and then the third rule is you have to stay and talk about it. Once we get done with this movie, you don't get up and brush off the particles of popcorn and spill your soda and race off and head out and do whatever you're going to do for the rest of your Friday, right? Like, no, you have to stay so that we can talk about it. I want us to actually treat it like I think it was made, right? So to be a thing that we're supposed to experience. Now, not everything I think falls into that camp.
Mm-hmm.
We can get to the end of a Michael Bay movie and I don't, okay, we can talk about this for, I don't know, 14 seconds or something, right? There was a lot of military stuff. It was very shiny, loud, right? So not every movie lends itself to that as well as others,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think that's in some ways, these are things that feel in some ways like obligations on the audience or on me as a person who's experiencing something somebody else has made, right? And I think that's kind of the overarching principle here, which is I think I should be sincere about this. One of the signs of my sincerity is that I will try to see what this person is trying to do instead of deciding that this person can't possibly be doing something. So that's kind of the first step. Okay, so what are you trying to say? And if I get halfway in there and decide, oh, I don't like the thing you're trying to say, fine, I'll get out, right? But let's start by saying, what are you trying to say? What is the thing that you're trying to show me? What are you trying to represent here, right? I think many filmmakers are trying to capture something, right? They don't necessarily have an agenda or something they're trying to push. They're trying to kind of capture something that seems real and true to them and show it to somebody else, right? And I have experiences where I think this is not a filmmaker who I think thinks what I do about almost anything, but there is something real and true that they did capture and showed to me, right? And so and I think as an audience member or as somebody who's reading a work a novel or somebody who's looking at a painting or any of these things, listening to music, I think to say, okay, so I'm trying. This is essentially a conversation. It's a conversation which, unlike a conversation I'm having with you, which is happening right now, the two of us. This is a conversation which often takes place in disparate times, right? Somebody wrote this book, Brothers K. I can't have a conversation with Dostoevsky the way I am with you, but that book is a conversation with Dostoevsky. So let's have this conversation, right? And I think that's something which, as an audience member or somebody who's interacting with the work of art, I think that's important, right? And I think that's what Lewis is getting at in a lot of ways in Experiment in Criticism. This is an actual conversation. Now, if you start the conversation, you decide you're a jerk, I don't want to be in this conversation anymore. That's fine, right? But you should start the conversation and then judge the conversation based on what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
So this is a very roundabout way of I guess getting at the Oppenheimer question, right? I think I don't know that it lends itself very well to blanket statements.
Yeah.
On either side, I wouldn't say no, it's totally fine. Also, I think at least one of those scenes in particular in Oppenheimer is very uncomfortable. And if somebody said, "Gee, that seemed really uncomfortable," and say, I think it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I think it'd be complicated to figure out, is that something which is the message that Nolan's trying to get across there? Is that worth doing this thing, right? Is it important? It seems to me there's a real question there.
Right.
But I think that's a question that we should grapple with, as opposed to so somebody says, I saw Oppenheimer and I thought those scenes were too much and they should not have been in there. I'd say that both tells me something about the way you interacted with Oppenheimer, which I appreciate, and also tells me something about you, and I may be in that same camp.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But that feels like a more, in some ways, a more sincere conversation than I have not seen this thing and will not see this thing and think it should not exist.
Right. Yeah.
But maybe it shouldn't exist, but it's hard for me to get through those first two steps, right? Which is, I haven't seen this thing and I have a judgment about it. And I think that's the point that Lewis is making, I think, in most ways.
Right. You got he's kind of saying that you do have to be as receptive as possible, looking for whatever good the author, he says, but the artist is trying to convey. And that makes me think of, I guess, a couple more things. You were talking about how it's not totally relative or subjective or anything like that, but
Sure.
It isn't black and white. And so kind of the way I'm imagining this is I guess it is black and white, but with a gradient of sorts when it comes to prudence and certain and just the differences of the instances that we're applying our judgments to movies and all of that, as well
Sure.
as perhaps it maybe it when it comes to particular actions, how well does it not necessarily condoning those actions, but how well does it lend itself to the actual story, right?
Sure.
Or at least to the character arc and development there.
Sure.
I guess is one way that I'm imagining this as well.
Sure. Right. So I guess it does seem to me that it's important to say, I think there is, yeah. So maybe saying it's not black and white is not a great way of describing it. I think there is a right or a wrong here. I think, and I don't want to say that it's all relative, because I don't think, in fact, it's all relative.
Yeah.
But that it is more dependent on particular, I find the older I get, the less I'm drawn to universals and the more I'm interested in particulars, right? The older I get, the more I'm interested in people. Like, I'm watching these people, like this particular person is just interesting to me. Now, there's probably a larger principle at work here, but I'm actually just really interested in the particulars here, right? And I think that it applies here in a lot of ways. You don't have to say it's all relative, but the different members of the audience react in different ways. Heck, I react differently.
Yeah.
18-year-old me, 18 unmarried-year-old me reacts differently to certain things than whatever I am, 46-year-old married me. There are certain things that I react to differently, right? It's not, in fact, because I've been desensitized. It's because I have experiences as a 46-year-old married man that I did not have as an 18-year-old, whatever I was then, right? And so that does, in fact, change the way I interact with certain things. It changes the way I interact with things that aren't a question of morality at all, right? So I can remember watching Bicycle Thieves when I was 22 years old, the great Italian neorealism film about the father and his young son right after World War II, and how important the bicycle is for his father to be able to do the work that he needs to do. And then somebody steals the bicycle and it affects his father's ability to do everything. And then eventually the father ends up doing the same thing himself, because he's kind of driven so much by the need to support his family that he ends up stealing somebody's bike. And the young boy kind of watches this happen, right? Kind of sees his father become the thing that his father was so angry about at the beginning, right? And I think in many ways it's a movie about the fact that all children at some point see their parents as people instead of as parents. Like, oh shoot, you're like all the rest of us, right? And I think that's in fact an important moment for children, and it's an important moment for parents. But I can remember watching that when I was probably 20 years old and enjoying it a lot. And then I remember watching it within months of Dominic, my first son, being born, and realizing that I reacted entirely differently to it. Right. Simply because now I had a child, and all of a sudden I saw, oh, so this is a thing that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And before that, it didn't occur to me that way. Right. And so that's not even something that has to do with morality at all. Right. And it's not even something that involved, 40 years of experience or something. It's a couple of years between when I saw it the first time and when I saw it the second time. And I remember realizing the way I react to the movie is very dependent on me, right? Not just on a great filmmaker will have some of these things in his mind. He's trying to get certain reactions out of people, right? But if DeSica had been trying to get that out of me when I was 19 or 20, he just couldn't. But the thing I think that movie's trying to do didn't hit me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that's an important thing to think about too. Like, it's part of why I see, again, obligation is not quite the right word, but there's a certain receptivity that I should have to what I'm doing. It doesn't mean that I say everybody can do everything, and
Mm-hmm.
that there isn't a right or a wrong way of doing these things. And I do have questions of, like, so even aside from the question of what it's like to see it or to experience it, what about the creating of it? That has its own kind of moral, complicated moral question there. What if you're an actor and an actress doing this thing? Like,
Yeah.
so anyway, those things just seem to me certainly they get complicated.
Oh, yeah.
The way that they play out is not black and white.
Right.
That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that there isn't a right or a wrong, or there aren't principles that should be at play here. But the way that they work out is very dependent on a lot of different factors. So.
Right. There are a ton of different factors at play, all the little bits and particulars, like you were saying, especially when it comes to a different person will read a different movie differently from
Yep.
anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And hence, I guess, lending to, obviously subjective factors because of the sheer number of factors, not only in the moral landscape, I guess is what you're saying, but also just everywhere else, because there are so many other aspects to film that can be looked at beyond what is morally permissible in a film.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
That some that obvious, I guess, based on my thesis, some Christians tend to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's see. And I guess the other thing I was thinking of that I just remembered was when it comes to the entertainer, there are kind of two kinds, but I think of especially the medieval fool. Shakespeare kind of alludes to this, although he's very smart and obviously wants to say something with the idea of the fool, but they entertain and or say have a message that they're trying to get put across, and
Sure.
through their entertainment, I guess. So that's I guess another way of thinking is that there is the whatever kind of pulls your attention to a certain form of entertainment, but also what is it actually trying to say. So those are all of, I guess, my understanding of that as well. Don't know if that made any sense, but that's it's kind of just a note I found.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say something?
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's just had another question. I'm curious because we've been talking obviously about, darker films. And I'm curious about your stance on comedy, like how to read that. How different is that from darker films, nor kind of dramatic films. And obviously there are different kinds of comedy, but I'm
Uh-huh.
curious to hear your thoughts on those.
Yeah, so this is a great example that I was just talking about, where the particular people in the audience have a big say on how you react to something. I
Mhm.
don't tend to like comedy very
Yeah.
much. Um, I don't think it's because I don't have a sense of humor. I think I've experienced that I have a sense of humor in other places, right?
Yeah.
But I don't tend to like comedies because I see the puppet strings too much. I feel like I'm always being set up.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, you're working towards a joke. I can kind of see where this is going. Oh, okay, yeah, we got to the joke. That's not universally true. There are some wonderful comedies. One of the ones we watch here in the house and love almost more than anything is How to Steal a Million, which is a um, Audrey Hepburn and Peter O'Toole comedy, which I think is very funny. Um, and so there are certain I will find comedies that I enjoy watching, um, but mostly they feel like I see the inner workings too much, and so they don't. I don't tend to react to them um, terribly well, right? So that's, I think, again, in an experiment in criticism, Lewis kind of talks about detective stories, right?
Mhm.
Look, if you really, really don't like detective stories, then don't write about detective stories because you just hate it, right? And you'll never like one. So I
Or a
tend
creative
not,
flow. Yeah. Mhm.
right? So I tend not to gravitate towards comedy. The other genre like that's this way for me is horror. Um,
Mhm.
I just don't like it. I don't
Sure.
like being scared. I don't like jump scares. I'm timid in any number of ways. I don't like that. And
Yeah.
so I don't, I'm not drawn to them. I don't, usually, again, there are some exceptions there, just as there are with comedies, but it tends to be, I don't see kind of the capturing and presenting of reality or truth as clearly in those genres as I do in more stuff that's more on the drama side.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think that's much more about the way I react to things than it is about the medium itself or the genre itself, right? So
Sure.
so I know there are a lot of people, and I read every time I have the opportunity. I read these articles by people who I respect a lot, writing about horror movies and why they think they're interesting, and it seems compelling to me. And then I just don't watch the thing because I don't like it, right? Um, so, but too many people who I respect and enjoy think that for me to think that they're all wrong about horror or comedy. I think it's much more the way I'm reacting to something, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I think C.S.
see,
Lewis, he briefly talks about entertainment. We've kind of been brushing on this a little bit. He talks about
sure.
entertainment as it's kind of an entrance exam, so to speak, and
Mhm.
what will grip one won't grip another. And I guess
Right.
that's also part of why you gravitate more towards the dramatic as opposed to the comedic or the horrific kind of films.
Right. So another example for that for me would be Tarkovsky, Andrei Tarkovsky. I don't know. Have we? I didn't think we watched any Tarkovsky when you were
I
here.
don't think we did. Yeah.
He's a Russian director who I love.
I remember reading the book that's kind of on the shelf or
Yes,
yeah.
yes, sculpting in time, right? So,
Yeah.
I love his stuff. I love reading about what he's thinking when he makes movies. I love watching them.
Hmm.
They are very slow and very philosophical. There's a lot of very dense kind of philosophical talking that goes on. And I I enjoy that, but it is much less likely for me to find a bunch of the college kids and show them a Tarkovsky movie and have them enjoy it. It's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
and it's not. Again, I think for some reason, I think I could come up with some reasons, but it just I respond to it, and I know a lot of people that don't, right?
Mhm.
And that's first of all, that's just interesting to me. Like I don't know why I don't like comedy. I've come up with kind of an account of it. Well, I think it's because I see the jokes, and I think that's true. But um, I don't know. how it is that I just react to these things sometimes and how I don't react to these things, right? And there is in fact a bit of an instinct there, or a bit of simply an emotional response. It's not, and I can think through and come up with something that makes sense to me why I react this way. But it's just interesting that people react differently that way. I guess the exception that I would make for comedy is that um, I tend to really like animation, and a lot of animation is comedy.
Pixar, stuff like that.
Yeah, or Disney stuff, or I mean, I'll watch a lot of things,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
but I almost always like animation.
Mhm.
I enjoy, and I think I react to the um, childlike element there, and kind of there's kind of a built-in childlike element, not childish, but childlike in animation, and there's kind of a weightlessness to it almost, right? So there's just I enjoy that. Now a lot of those are comedies, but I don't think the thing I'm enjoying is the comedy. I think it's actually the animation itself that I tend to enjoy, right? And then every now and then, like Satoshi Kon, who's doing animated drama. I mean that's my wheelhouse. I'll watch that stuff forever, basically, and that stuff is fantastic. But yeah, I just don't always know why people react the way that they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Just one or two more questions, especially
Sure.
on experiment and criticism. Um, so I mentioned, and you agreed with in my previous video about on experiment and criticism, that it's kind of underrated and overlooked as a Lewis book, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts as to why that might be.
Oh, interesting. I don't know that I have thought about that particularly. I think, um, I guess it's not as obviously apologetic.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to think of Lewis as um, writing either fiction for children, like the Narnia books, or fiction that looks like it's for children that's for adults, like Till We Have Faces, or the Space Trilogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or writing apologetics. And this is just an odd. I think one of the reasons I think it feels to me like it's overlooked is because people are not expecting him to be in this space,
Yeah.
right? That's probably my first thought on it. I think also one of the reasons is because it doesn't have, in some ways, it's asking people to do something which is more difficult than they would otherwise do, right? Um, because it's kind of preventing you from saying, let's not pay attention to this, right? So I do think, and in some ways, it's not necessarily asking to do something easy. It's easier to say, I have a pretty good sense of what this movie is, or this book is, or this painting is, without having to start the conversation at all, right? And I think he is kind of asking people to have, essentially, to have conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Let's and that's not always comfortable, or to use his own term, right? Aslan's not a tame lion, right? These things can, it's not a safe thing
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, right? Um, and that is why I think when we were talking a little bit earlier, sometimes you kind of go along and think, oh, okay, I went further on this than I wanted to, so I'm going to kind of pull this back in now. I've learned something a little more about myself than I thought a moment ago. Um, but that's not always easy. Um, yeah, so I think those are probably the reasons. It seems to me it's both, it's operating in a space that people don't tend to think of Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says, hey, who do you think of off the top of your head who's got interesting things to say about literary criticism? I don't think Lewis is in anybody's tool bag, right?
Yeah.
It's also very short. It's also very short.
Oh, it is. It's like 150.
Um,
It's amazing.
yeah. So I don't know. I think those things play together. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I can't even remember exactly why I happened upon it. I think it was because I was exploring this idea of what relationship the work of art has to the artist, right? So, Joss Whedon, for example, says one of the great things about a movie. He says making a movie is like having a kid. Like it grows up and starts talking back to you.
Hmm.
So that there is a I think it can be really interesting. It's like the sculpting in time. I think you can read what Tarkovsky's trying to do when he makes a movie. I think that's really interesting. You can read what Flannery O'Connor's trying to do in A Good Man Is Hard to Find when she talks about moments of grace. You can read that. It's really interesting. But there is a distinction between the artist and the thing that they create, right? And so I think often a work of art can have something in it which was put in there by the artist's efforts to capture reality in some interesting way, but the artist didn't think about, right? And I think it was when I was kind of trying to grapple with this thing, like how much if I watch a movie and I think this is an amazing movie which is about this, it's a metaphor for this thing, and then I watch the director's commentary and I think, gosh, he didn't mean any of that stuff. Should I say I was wrong about this, or should I say, oh shoot, I don't think he even really realizes why his movie is great. Here's why it's great, right? So and I think that idea of experiencing the work is kind of a conversation. And I don't even necessarily have to agree with the artist. If the artist says my movie's about how everybody in the police force in Boston is corrupt, I can say, well, I think in fact that's what that movie is about. I just think that movie's wrong about the police. But I can have that conversation, right? I can be like, wait a second, I'm being sincere here. You're being sincere. We're talking about this thing that you've made. I mean, it's kind of an interesting conversation because the director's not here. I'm watching it without him, but it is a conversation. We're kind of communicating across time, right? And I'm saying, gosh, I think you put something, there's something in here that maybe you didn't intend that I think is spectacular. And if I read what you say, I think, gosh, you didn't realize this spectacular thing. Here's a spectacular thing that you did in your movie, right? So I think that is very much kind of the way Lewis is encouraging us to do this, right? No, this is a thing you have to be, there's a certain sincerity that I need to bring to the conversation as an audience member. Just like I think there should be a certain kind of sincerity that the artist is bringing to the conversation, right? So if you watch something where it feels like the artist, the director is not being sincere, that's just irritating.
Yeah.
Like, why am I doing this? If you're not serious about what you're doing, why should I be serious about it, right? I think that works that kind of on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess Lewis himself also kind of alludes to how it's a dialogue in time, especially when he talks about, well, if we use my system, right? I think he says this at the very end. It'll outright get rid of immediate condemnation of books that have more to offer than the critic initially thinks. And
Right.
what will actually judge the book is the societal the societal approach to that book and its attitude towards that book as time goes on. And at least he says something to that effect. And
Sure. And it's it's a little bit like something that's saying, oh, the great books, right? You come from a great books college. I came from a great books college. Why do we say they're great? And they all seem to be relatively old. Like, are there no great books now?
Right.
No, I think there are, but we'll recognize them later. Right? There is a way in which that conversation is an ongoing one, right? And I can think of some books now where I think, gosh, I think people will be reading this in 200 years. I think people will be reading this in 500 years. Does it belong in this list right now? Well, I don't know. There is certainly kind of the test, not the test of time, but the test of many minds saying, I have begun this conversation with this author, with this director, and I think it's a good one, right? So let's keep this conversation in the world of what we're doing, right? The great conversation. Let's make this part of the conversation. It's good. It's been going, and so there is, I think, a way in which kind of the collectiveness of it does something there. Again, something doesn't become good just because a lot of people like it, but a lot of people liking something could tell you something about it. Right?
Yeah. And sometimes I'll have a conversation when it comes to movies, especially with some people at Wyoming Catholic, right? Where obviously what book could possibly what movie could possibly beat a good book, right? A great book.
Sure.
Well, the thing is we've only had movies for so long is one of the first things I will go to is and what we don't have, we probably don't have at this time a movie, Homer's movie, right? We don't have that grand of a scale for movies. Maybe that's just the modern age, maybe but maybe that's also just because time hasn't done that yet. We've only had it for so long, but we can still look at some, as of now, the good movies of history and up to this point.
Sure. Yeah, and I do think some of the recency can be a problem there, right? So, if something's this recent, how can it be good? But for me, I think my reaction much more is they're just different things, right? So if somebody says, I mean, how could you expect a movie to kind of match up to a great book? I guess I'd say, I don't know that you'd make that argument about, I don't know, the Brandenburg Concertos and a great book, or Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and a great book. Maybe they would. I mean, maybe somebody's really internally consistent, but most people, it seems to me, what they're doing there is they're seeing, I think, more similarity between the art forms than I see. Right?
Sure.
They're saying, well, a book and a movie are basically the same thing. And I'm like, I think a book and a movie are a lot closer to a book and a symphony. Like, I just think they're different. Yeah. They're just different things. I don't know how you would say this is better than that.
Yeah.
I certainly think you could say you enjoy that more than I enjoy movies. You seem to enjoy books the way I enjoy movies, but they're just, I don't know how. It's hard for me to, it's the apples and oranges thing. I don't know how to get those things into the same conversation. Certainly it seems to me that there are similarities. Most movies are trying to tell a story the way most novels are trying to tell a story. But the visual element in a book is exclusively your imagination. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's an amazing thing.
Right.
In fact, sometimes I will decide not to watch a movie because I do not want somebody else's imagining of something in my head. When I read that book, I want to see what I've got. I don't want to see what somebody else has got, right? But film is far more visual than reading is in the Marshall McLuhan way, like the medium is a message way, right? The medium itself is more visual. It doesn't mean that it works better than my imagination. Yeah. But it's a fundamentally different kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's also just something that I've heard argued as well for studying Shakespeare like a book. It's a totally different medium. It's meant to be performed visual,
sure,
or at least done. But there is, I guess, some crossover, obviously, with reading a script, reading a book, some similarities there, right? Yeah, and I guess it's just I don't know, fascinating to take them at their value as best as we can. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
You betcha. That was very fun.
Yeah, this was awesome. Hope to have you on again. That would be so much fun.
Well, I'm always willing to talk about movies. You know that.
Oh yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much, and God bless.
God bless, Joe. Thank you.